My name is Ken Hall. I work with Gensler. I have firm-wide responsibility for design performance. It's really good to look out and see many people that I've met before and recognize, and to see really a lot of smart people here. I will begin this by telling you that I'm not one of them. I am not a supply chain guru by any stretch of the imagination. I learned a lot this morning that relates to what I'm going to show you today. Because what I want to show you today is kind of the customer perspective, the user perspective, the perspective of the designer that's trying to make things. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is an initiative that some of my colleagues are deeply involved in. And I've been monitoring it peripherally because I thought it was important for people here to be aware of it. Some of you might want to participate in it. I think some of you will have some deep insight and expertise into it. And I've already gained a lot of that this morning. It is essentially an issue to dig into the AEC supply chain, which is an amazingly complex supply chain, and it never repeats any product twice. It is about, in many ways, exposing information from the beginning of the process so that we can make the right decisions. And this man really sort of was an inspiration to create this. Yvon Chouinard is the founder of Patagonia and has been working in cleaning the supply chain in his industry for 20 years. And 2 years ago formed a coalition, and some stories are being shared around, and he's been very inspiring to our industry. So the Sustainable Apparel Coalition has 49 members currently. It began in 2010, and that really led to a presentation at the Design Leaders Forum in September, which led to the formation of an industry group, the AEC Transparency Initiative, which intends to mimic and model a lot of the things that the Apparel Coalition has done, which is to create an open source initiative to share information across this industry. Now, an easy mistake to make is to think that it's all about healthy materials. And we have this happen all the time in our industry, where right now there's a lot of focus on materials issues, a lot of toxicity issues. It would probably be easier to just go down that path. But in fact, there's a dream here of doing something which is even larger, which is not just about healthy materials, but it's about having a better handle on all kinds of information that is flowing through this supply chain. And we have a perspective on it, but boy, we don't have Jack's perspective. You know, we don't have a lot of the perspectives that are in this room as I look at it. So we think we have some insight on it, but boy, we do not have the expertise to do this ourselves. Currently, well over 50 different organizations are involved with this. There is, in fact, the third webinar related to this initiative was running today, right before lunchtime. So this literally got started in December of last year, and now they've been having a monthly call, and they're trying to figure out how to organize themselves and ramp this thing up. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of very interesting questions and challenges. And so we'll sort of just look at the basics of how we're thinking about this, okay, which is that we need access to this information so that we can create mental models in our mind that enable us to make good decisions. So we're the consumer, if you will, of this information. Okay, so disclosure. Where does all of this information come from? It's a mess. It comes from all over the place. We've talked about it a lot today in terms of a lot of different supply chain systems. I'm not going to belabor this. And then we've got this issue of understanding. This sort of seems to be the new territory in the ecosystem, where we've got a lot of new people that are in this space trying to make sense of this, and there are some challenges here. And then we've got the people that are in the business of making good decisions. And a lot of the people that are responsible for that in terms of our vendors are at COFES. All right, so there's good news here. There's a lot going on. The ecosystem is evolving. There's public awareness. There's bad news. I mean, you guys have seen it all today. I'm not going to belabor this. A lot of what has been said before really relates to us, not scalable. Looked at another way, we have the disclosure side of things, research and discovery. We have understanding, how do we curate and aggregate this? And then, of course, we have good decisions. And so the position that we sort of have taken at the beginning of all of this is that this really is very messy. There are many different routes to the information, and that actually could be a benefit from a diversity point of view. But what we think is that we need to replace this middle mode of this model. That this is where there needs to be an open source data formats with public interfaces. And yet to even try and do that has its own challenges, because you can imagine there's a little ecosystem out there of businesses that are growing their businesses, and they're trying to do it by providing advantage, competitive advantage, and adding value. So it's not a, how we go about doing something like this in the context that we're under is a big challenge. The system is broken. Well, we could spend the whole DaS symposium talking about the ways in which the system is broken. I'm not going to belabor any of these. We're all looking at it and wrestling with it every day of our lives. When you look at this diagram, you really do get an understanding of how complex this is. This is very real from our industry, just in terms of the various organizations, institutions, and systems out there that are trying to come to and understand issues related to just material health issues. And interesting, I think this is interesting from a couple of different levels. Salesforce is one of our clients, and it's fundamental to shift how you think about your business. And here the Salesforce people are providing a Salesforce materials assessment facility within their own organization to help their people understand this. And clearly in Silicon Valley, we've got some organizations that are much more concerned about this than some other places in the world. And of course, as designers, the real question becomes, how do you consume this information? How do you make sense out of it? How do you make decisions when you yourself are not an expert in materials or supply chains and will never be an expert in that? And then there are these harmonization efforts. People that are trying to harmonize all of the different systems that are out there doing these various different things. Look at this. This is interesting. So the Materials Health Harmonization Task Force, and I think this has a laser on it. Full disclosure to the public, partial disclosure, disclosed only to profiler and assessor as they're going through and looking at these various systems and trying to figure out how to harmonize these different producers of information. I mean, I within my industry at this point in time, there's really some blowback, if you will. Blowback that is, we're getting frustrated by the additional layers of certification systems and all of these things that are being layered onto our practice that are really adding friction and impeding from us actually becoming a learning organization. So we have these various challenges and opportunities. I'm not one of the kind of people that reads things off of PowerPoint slides to you. I think all of you are very capable of doing that. I think there is an interesting point on number 2 here, and we'll come back and look at that a little bit more, but this notion of disclosure of contents and disclosure of hazards should be separated is an interesting idea, and I think there's truth in that. And this is one of the reasons why. First Prop 65 disclosure list in 1987 consists of 30 chemicals, currently lists over 800. These were listed and later delisted. So our understanding of hazards changes over time, which is a reason why hazards versus what's in the products should be separated. I think there's an interesting subpoint that goes to this, which is how we view science in society. And the fact that science does take an evolving picture, and it does change its mind from time to time. That doesn't mean you discount what science has to offer. And there's an awful lot of interesting thinking about, how science is serving industry and what scientists are doing in terms of their own reputation and the ability of society to trust and understand scientists. I think there's a lot we could talk about in that regard.
Ken, those are delisted because they're no longer on the market or no longer a threat?
I have not the slightest idea. That would be the kind of information it would be nice to be able to get at when you needed to know it. Yeah. I'm sorry, did you have a thought?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Good answer. Location matters. This is one of our buildings in Pittsburgh on the left. It's a building that breathes. We've worked this out with a high-rise. We can't do that in Beijing, obviously. So, yeah, so location matters tremendously. Not only from an outside air quality point of view, but regulations, cultural attitudes, all kinds of things. So basic idea here is that fundamentally right now we just sort of have ingredient level disclosure. What we really want to move to is a better approach where we have information flowing up a chain at a part and product level, where everybody has to play in this space and contribute information. Therein lies a conundrum. So smarter aggregation will make it faster and easier to produce whole buildings and life cycle assessments and everything. Again, we don't want to just do materials analysis. We also want to do energy analysis. We want to do life cycle analysis. We want to have the whole picture. We're moving from a time where we've really mastered building information modeling. We are moving into a world of project information modeling, and I think into a world of supply chain information modeling. So we need quality design data if we're going to make good decisions. And what are the characteristics of quality design data? I think open source is very interesting. I'm really interested in what Jack had to say about federated models, public interfaces to that data, ISO standards, all of that's really important. Of course, we've looked at this, and this is not what we have in the AEC industry. We do not have the ability to manage that supply chain, and we don't do it on a repetitive basis. I mean, talk about the ultimate organic reconfiguring supply chain. The AEC industry is it in many ways. Every project is a new supply chain. Now, there are some other very interesting models that we can learn from, and one of the inspirations or efforts of this group is to go out and learn from these other industries as much as we possibly can and not reinvent anything. So clearly, there's a lot to be learned from the automotive industry and their IMDS system. I think this concept of a referencing structure permitting aggregation of an entire vehicle content without placing too much of a high burden on any individual company is a key concept. But what we have currently is just a bunch of silos. And frankly, we have that within our own organization. We're trying to overcome that inside of our own organization, much less across the industry. So we have a vision. This says draft. It is very much in draft. It's a straw man. Part of this, I mean, we're so early in this initiative that the vision and the mission are still being developed. And there's some reasons why they're still being developed. And one of those is we have all of these parallel organizations and initiatives that are out there. And we have to be careful that we don't actually add more fragmentation and redundancy to the problem, and that we actually operate at the right level to be complementary. So, a whole bunch of things about why we want to do design transparency. I don't know about this last one. We believe that designers and makers who engaged every day in creating the built environment can lead the way in defining a practical, scalable approach to AC design transparency. I don't know. I think we need a lot more smart people helping us. We're the consumer of this, so we know what works for us. We can't design this. We can't do this. And I think this is really important. So how will we fail? Strong early interest followed by drop-off of engagement? Check. Lots of talk, little action? Check. Redundancy and overlap with other organizations and initiatives? You got it. I don't think I need to carry on. To me, the really big question here is why in the heck are we even trying to do this as a voluntary industry initiative? This is really important. This cannot be done by a group of busy people taking an extra 2 or 3 hours a month to get on a couple of phone calls and do a little bit of work in the evenings and weekends and advance an initiative. Right? This is important. Now we've got, we've got a certain amount of companies that have each stepped up with a certain amount of seed money. But if we're going to pull this off, we have to get really serious. We're going to have to get software vendors interested that are really serious about this. And we're going to need C-suite involvement and engagement and belief and commitment of resources to make this happen. We need smart people thinking about this in a detailed, technical way. At least that's what I think. What I'm really curious about is to hear what all of you think, because I think you have much more insight into this than I do. So what we need is something actually that's much more organic. We want to know, how do we plant these seeds? How do we keep it healthy? How do you get critical mass where there are people participating, it's growing, it's happening? What will it take for the information silo owners to participate? Lots of great questions there. So, the AEC Industry Transparency Initiative is very much up and running, looking at these 6 issues right now, looking at vision and mission. Big question, how do you prioritize the high value performance data? What's the low-hanging fruit in this? And maybe it is the materials health issues. Maybe it's something else. Engage leadership in other industries, check. Governance approach is an important one. We're doing a lot of talking about that right now. Funding sources will ultimately be important, because if we don't pursue funding and turn this into a real initiative, it will go nowhere like so many others, and we're also looking at the hosting platform currently. It's very much real. You can go to this website, you can sign up, you'll be on the email list, you can participate in the calls. What it needs is leadership. Pretty well said it all. Was there a joke back there in the back?
No, there wasn't.
Yeah, there's a joke in the front. Yeah, I know. Everybody's looking for it. Yeah.
And the answer is?
I'm done. Seriously, I wanted to socialize this with you. Frankly, I'm worried about it. It's a voluntary initiative. The whole reason we have this problem is that the supply chain has externalized all this information. The information wasn't necessary. It's costly to put in place. It's not profitable or easy to do. What is the real motivation for them to actually expose this information throughout the supply chain? How are we actually going to manage that? I do have a side question. How many, we got 2 books. How many of you got 2 books before coming here to read? How many of you read one of them? How many of you read 2 of them? I knew you would have read 2. I chose Existence to start on as the first one. It's a good story, isn't it? It's got me thinking about some things. I want the little glasses where the thing pops up in my iris and starts telling me all the material impacts, and it's very cool stuff. But frankly, to be perfectly honest with you, I have a different point of view. I think we've got to head towards more simplicity. I think we need shorter supply chains. I think we need more local supply chains. I think we need more commitment to local community. And frankly, based on something that Scott said to me, I think that's where we're headed, whether we like it or not. Scott said a couple of years ago to me that the supply chain of the future, say 40 or 50 years from now, is going to look a lot like the supply chain of the past, say about 40 or 50 years ago. And I think he's probably right about that. Question. I've pontificated enough now that we've got a few people that want to pontificate back.
I'll get the ball rolling because I stood right where you were at what we call the Mid-Atlantic Regional Small Satellite Community Workshop. And I asked everybody. Everybody says, yes, this is something we want to do. And I heard, well, yeah, that we want to do something. And I said, so who's willing to help?
Yep.
Yeah, we all heard the pin drop.
Yep.
And I was sitting there thinking about that. That was a life-changing moment for me. Mm-hmm. And the thing that we in a small satellite environment, there's so many parallels because they're very, very complicated systems with really, really radical different stakeholder needs, and you have to meet them before you conceptualize that small satellite. That's supposed to happen quick. Otherwise, it's a big satellite and it takes a long time. And it just doesn't sell. And the answer that I've come to right now is show the value proposition first. Because what you just said about the short supply chains and the local profitability, I'm thinking about listening to the Toto presentation that was here last week, where they were talking about sending their porcelain out for road beds, and they tried clam beds first, and for some reason people didn't like broken toilets in the bay to grow clams, but then they realized that they could, put it off to the roadbed people, and all of a sudden there was a huge revenue stream back. Like I think when we start to show the value of that shorter supply chain, that's when the leadership's going to show up. I'll hand the mic off after saying, if you could go back to your chart. We've sat here in the DaS Symposium for 4 years now, I think. And I think you had the chart there with the bubbles and the lines that showed from ingredients to products. I think showing the value and the placement in that structure there, this one, back to one more, that was showing the value and the placement there is where the coordination will start.
Deke or Jack first, and then Deke, and we'll head back to the back.
I've observed that whenever a group of well-meaning people are in anguish for more than 3 years, it's because they're doing what they know how to do instead of what they should be doing. And in your case, I suggest to you that you are bothering yourself about data and how to organize it when you should be sorting out the dialogue that needs to happen in a design group.
In a what?
In a design group. Because once the dialogue becomes clear in the terms of what decisions need to be made when, then the information required to make those decisions becomes evident. Then people who have the information can volunteer at that time the relevant information, which turns out to be about 5% of what you're struggling to manage here.
Yeah, yep.
And the biggest, in my view, the biggest problem that you have is that chart you just showed, which is a hierarchy of data.
Mm-hmm.
Because whenever you depict a complex web of activity as a hierarchy, you only make it more complex. So focus on the dialogue. How should we design? And as a matter of fact, at JPL 12 years ago, they started a new product development project, examining the dialogue that should happen. Richard Evans, the late Richard Evans, unfortunately, at George Mason University, wrote 2 or 3 delicious papers on specify down and propose up. Get a dialogue running down the thing.
I think the key thing I heard there, Jack, was the concept of delicious papers. But seriously, and that might have been your talk, I forget now, I've got notes on it. Really the notion of what we've got to focus on is not just that dialogue, but on the decision support process, the decision-making process. No, I'm with you. So, Deke, you had something.
Yeah, just one question, well, two actually. Are you looking just nationally or internationally?
This is definitely international.
Okay. All right. Because I think there are some other people out there that are looking at that we can talk about.
Yeah.
And then the other, I guess, is really trying to find who is the beneficiary. And that's who really will understand the value. And that's who we need to get the value proposition.
I know, and that's one of the challenges here, because the real beneficiary is the one that none of our business models support. The real ultimate stakeholder is ultimately us through a healthy ecosystem. Right. That beneficiary has no vote in this. That's the a crux of the issue. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Ferris Noel from Scion Research. Ken, I love exactly what you're doing, and it makes sense. But I support where's Nathaniel at? Right behind. I support it. He took the words right out of my mouth. It is the value proposition. I was reading your vision and mission statement because I read pretty fast, and I didn't see anything in there about what is it, basically, what is the value proposition, and why should I do this? Because at one point in my career, I was in charge of energy management for North America for Chrysler, from Mexico all the way down, from Canada to Mexico, and everything in between. And in the 90s, it was everything about emissions. We need to do this. We got to save the earth. But the biggest tension has always been the CFO and everybody else.
Right.
You can line them all up. There's always going to be the CFO and everybody else. And so if you can't convince him or show him the bottom line some way, somehow, unless the CEO grabs him around the throat and tell him you're going to do this, it's going to be the CFO that you have to convince. And somehow, some way, it's got to be, back to what Nathan was saying, back to the value proposition that has to marry both the environmental concern, which everybody, the stakeholders and everybody else needs to be concerned about, but in some way, folding in something that the CFO, without having a hand around his throat, will listen to.
No, I agree 100%. Thank you very much. Anyone else?
We're fighting against a culture, which you know, that likes to hide stuff. And when you're talking about design transparency, I'm not sure if you're simply talking about the transparency of building information or transparency of processes across the board. You know, 6 years ago when Deke and I wrote our book, we were trying to look at industries that were comparable to the building industry. And, you know, for many years we've tried to compare ourselves to automotive or aerospace, and those models don't work for obvious reasons. But one industry that looked very much like construction 50 years ago and doesn't look anything like construction today is agriculture. 50 years ago, agriculture and building construction shared very many characteristics. Today, they don't. Productivity in agriculture has increased 300% in 50 years, and in construction, it's 0. And we tried to understand what are the factors that allowed agriculture to move ahead so quickly, and for construction to, you know, what were the differences? The difference was information sharing. In the United States, there's an agricultural research station at every land-grant university. They work very, very closely with local farmers. So, you know, in Washington, they study apples and potatoes. In Wisconsin and Massachusetts, it's cranberries. And information in research makes its way into practice very, very quickly, and it's widely disseminated. It's all public. We do the opposite. We hide what we know because we think it's a competitive advantage. And in fact, what we're doing is shooting ourselves in the foot, because if the cost of creating the built environment went down, the size of the market would go up. And so I'm really excited about this initiative, but I hope it's going to extend beyond simply the information about buildings to encourage a culture where we share what we know about process, and stop thinking that, wow, you know, we have an idea that nobody else has and we're going to make a lot of money on it, because that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, and the reality there too was that we had gotten to a point where we could not feed our population based on the way we were doing business. I mean, so there was a inevitable.
If the increase in productivity in agriculture had matched the increase in productivity of construction over the last 50 years, which is 0, to feed the people of the United States, we would need a land mass 12 times greater than the United States. And we are a net exporter, so not only are we feeding our population, we're feeding other parts of the world. That phenomenon also of growth in agriculture is not unique to the United States. It's a first world phenomenon that's worldwide. And when we look at other countries, though they don't have the same system we have, they have the same culture and the same, you know, information sharing and close association between research and practice and information sharing. So if you give it away, it's going to come back to you. And so when we talk about the value proposition, you have to take the risk that sharing information is going to make you wealthier.
Yeah. And I think that very much is the spirit of this movement. I know we got to keep moving. Jack had a real quick question, comment.
Watch out for this 300% improvement in agriculture productivity. It has dropped our water table 45 feet average across the United States and filled it with thousands of tons of fertilizer chemicals. So it is mass production,
Right.
and mass production went out of style 50 years ago.
Right. We're moving into the world of design. The agriculture model is an interesting one, and I actually hope that we move towards an agriculture in the future that's a lot more like it was 50 years ago, a little bit like the supply chain. But there's an awful lot we could talk about there, because now you're getting into big business, you're getting into water tables, you're getting into nitrogen, you're getting into the lack of sustainability of small farmers. There's all kinds of things wrapped up in that. But it is a very powerful metaphor. I guess one closing thought, and then I'm definitely getting off this platform. But you made me think about it. It's something I've been looking at, because I'm definitely moving in a different direction. And one of the things that we've been looking at pretty heavily, and there's some secret stuff we're doing that's going to be announced soon, with respect to 3D printing of whole buildings, right? And I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of it. I think there will be specialty cases where it makes some sense after disaster, for example. But I want to know, see, that 3D printer, they aren't all magic. They got a lot of problems associated with them. And they have this problem that the supply chain has, which is it abstracts out impacts. What are these, it makes you think you're on the Star Trek Enterprise. You're just going to replicate things, and you don't have a waste stream. You don't have an income stream. And then you're dealing with the product that's coming out right now. It's just, it's not the same thing as something that's made by hand. We still move things physically. We still move things through space physically. The whole world isn't just a digital world.
But let's share what's being learned. For example, there was a project, 3D printing of a building in China that they shared part of their process, but they concealed a great deal of it, again, because they think they have something that nobody else has and they want to capitalize on it. Understand that. Another example, there's a project in New York that Skanska with Forest City was doing modular construction of apartment buildings, high-rise apartment buildings. And Skanska actually set up a factory to manufacture the modules. Something happened. The relationship fell apart. The developer took over the factory. We don't know what happened, but if there's a failure there and that knowledge were shared, we could learn from it. But what's going to happen is someone else who goes to attempt to do the same thing is going to remember, somebody got burned the last time and I don't know why, so I'm not even going to try. Mm-hmm. That's what's holding us back.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Very good, sirs. Thank you all very much.